This is the 2020 Torrance lecture, and the webinar will begin in a few seconds, in a few minutes. We'll start with the little schedule that I put there, introduction to the event itself, introduction to the speaker, and then soon after that, the lecture itself will begin. It's not a strictly timed event, so I've told Kina she can have as much time as she needs. And I imagine would not be more than an hour. So discussion begins at around 5:30 p.m. and it can go on for as long as until 6:30 p.m. or it can end sooner depending on how the discussion goes. But this is sort of, you know, how to manage your time in this situation. For those of you who can't stay the full 2 hours, the first hour is going to be the talk and the second hour is going to be the discussion. There are just some general guidelines to follow. You will see that there is, you have a chat window here, which you should use to put in any general comments you have or raise any issues that we should be aware of if you can't hear the speaker, for instance. There is also a raise hand function. If you press on the participant list, you can raise your hand, I think. That you should use in the discussion session when you want to ask a question to the speaker directly. We can make you a panelist then, and you can ask your question directly. And finally, you can also, if you choose not to ask a question directly, you could also use a Q&A function where you just type in your question and we can read it out for you and the speaker can take it from there. Yeah, if you have any questions, of course, you can always put general questions about how the event's going. You can always put it in the chat window. I'll keep repeating, I'll keep reposting the schedule and the guidelines for anyone who comes late so that they can see it as well. Okay, I think we can start to stream to Zoom now. Sarah, could you please introduce the event?
Yes. Good evening, afternoon, morning for some of you, and welcome to the 2020 E. Paul Torrance Lecture. My name is Dr. Sarah Sumners, and I'm the Associate Director here at the Torrance Center for Creativity and Talent Development at the University of Georgia. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome each of you to this annual event in honor of the life and legacy of Dr. E. Paul Torrance, who was a native Georgian and pioneer in research on the identification and development of creative potential. The Torrance Center is established in 1984 by the late Dr. Mary Fraser in order to honor his legacy and to continue that tradition of scholarship and excellence exemplified in his work. In addition to hosting the annual lecture, the Torrance Center sponsors and supports numerous different programs, such as the Beyonders Challenge program, training on the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking, and the Future Problem Solving Program International, just to name a few there. We also serve as a place to house Dr. Torrance's papers, making them accessible to students and creativity researchers worldwide, as well as a visiting scholars program that where we host scholars from throughout the world to come visit us here at the Torrance Center in order to study and conduct creativity research. We're an active and vibrant research, service, and outreach center, continually and daily inspired by the life and legacy of E. Paul Torrance. Or as Dr. Russell Yeaney, former Dean of the College of Education at UGA here, once noted, that the Torrance Center and the annual lecture are symbols of the commitment that the university has to further the lifelong work of Dr. Torrance. He presented us with the notion of creative thought, pursued the notion himself in many of his studies, and instilled in hundreds of students and colleagues a desire to more fully understand and implement those ideas. Indeed, Torrance gave the inaugural Torrance Lecture in 1985 as part of his retirement celebration. And at that time, he chose to highlight the careers and significant contributions of his students, characteristically deflecting the focus away from himself. His lecture emphasizes the global network and reach of his students, who in turn have affected thousands of others. Now, 35 years later, we still continue to see the need and the reach of that global network of people who understand and are active advocates for the spread of creativity and its importance to humanity. We believe that Professor Kina Lesky, our 2020 E. Paul Torrance Lecturer, is an integral piece of this worldwide effort, and we welcome her today. I'll now turn it back over to Dr. Anna Abraham for further introduction to Dr. Lesky.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for that. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Anna Abraham, and I began as the Torrance Professor and the Director of the Torrance Center a couple of months ago. I feel really fortunate indeed to be in this position of organizing and overseeing the annual Torrance Lecture. I'm fortunate because the annual Torrance Lecture is an event that allows us to showcase individuals who've demonstrated creative excellence in their life through their work, and also because it allows us the rare privilege of directly sharing a brief moment in time and space with such individuals to learn from their unique perspectives on the workings of our creative minds. When I thought about whom to invite to give this, the first Torrance Lecture on my watch, I was guided by a set of principles, and three that I mention here. First, that the person should embody the defining principles of creativity, namely that originality and relevance be unmistakable features of their work. Second, that the person should in some way be a force unto themselves in terms of the way they view and act on the world. They stand apart from the collective, yet the wisdom of their insights resonate across the board. And third, that their ideas on creativity are deeply meaningful, important, and unique, and deserve to be known far beyond the particular academic silos or professional contexts of their inception. The Torrance Lecture serves as a platform to that end. Kina was the first person who came to my mind, the very first person who came to my mind to deliver the Torrance Lecture. We've never met before, or seen each other, or even exchanged emails. Strangely enough, though, when I looked her up online after I had this initial idea to see if there were any recordings of her that I could access to hear her speak, her voice kind of seemed very, very familiar to me. And I wondered why that was. I think it's because her voice in speech is so similar to her voice in writing. The calmness, the clarity, the cadence, the depth, the precision, the generosity, the honesty, the boldness, and the creativity. The fidelity between the modes of expression was kind of uncanny to me. I first came across Kina's writing through her book, The Storm of Creativity, which was published in 2015 by MIT Press and has been translated into 4 languages, I think so far: Turkish, Russian, Chinese, and Korean. Her book is inspiring, revelatory, and genuinely informative. Her focus on sensibility, on the ongoing nature of the creative process, on openness, on problem making, on unlearning, on occupying the space of ambiguity, on cultivating a sense of uncertainty, on getting out of your own way, and much more. All of it is extraordinarily refreshing. In fact, it is perhaps the most useful work in the fields of creativity that I've had the good fortune to read in recent years. And my opinion on her book is an unusual one, going by the emphatically laudatory reviews of her works by icons in the creative arts alone. It's small wonder then that her name popped into my mind as the first when thinking of the 2020 Torrance Lecture. Kina received her undergraduate and graduate education in architecture at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in New York City and at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. She's been at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, for 31 years, where she's currently a professor of architecture, and she served as the head of department there as well between 2009 and 2013. She's taught in several departments at RISD: architecture, experimental and foundation studies, and industrial design. She authored the first semester core architecture design curriculum that has been used at RISD for almost 2 decades, serving thousands of students, which led to her authoring a book based on this pedagogy in 2007 called The Making of Design Principles. She's also the owner and principal of 360 Architecture, a firm which was founded in 1997 and has won multiple interior architecture and design awards. Her other awards include the 1997 Annual Young Architects Competition, which is awarded by the Architectural League of New York. In 2000, she was nominated for the Chrysler Design Award. She served as the City Architect Design Decision Review Advisor to the Mayor of Providence. And in 2017, she was inducted into the Rhode Island Design Hall of Fame. I could go on, but as we are all here to listen to her, I will end this introduction to the speaker, Kina Lesky, and I end it with the words of John Maida, who wrote the foreword to her 2015 book. Kina speaks many dialects of knowledge, from engineering equations to achieve structural integrity, to the perfect rhythm of a poem. Talking to her always reminded me of reading Faulkner, because there was always so much to gain from what she was saying as a barrage of free-flowing information. In anticipation of a truly delightful hour of creative insights, the Torrance Center at the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia are deeply honored and grateful to have Kina Lesky deliver the 2020 Torrance Lecture and warmly welcome her to speak on the topic entitled On Field.
Thank you. I am moved to tears. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Sarah. I'm very honored. You've made me feel like I have a lot of work to do to deserve what you've said. And I'm very honored to find out about Torrance, about your center, about your school. Very moved by it. And I'm going to go to my talk so you don't focus on my face anymore, but thank you very much for that introduction. I'm getting can we please confirm that you've seen my screen? Good. So I think the title of my talk is From Field. And I'm saying, I called it this because I am from a similar field as all of you in that it is creativity and education. And I'm calling it From Field because I think it's also the point of view that I'm taking in this talk, that it is from the inside. It's from the workings of creativity and education. And as Anna mentioned, I wrote this book called The Storm of Creativity, published 5 years ago, which was kind of the culmination of my thoughts. I'm not predominantly a writer, but it's a culmination of my thoughts of teaching. And I used the metaphor of a storm to organize the book. And I draw to think, I draw to understand the relations between things. And so the drawing, this animation that you're saying that I did, was the way in which I could organize my thoughts for the book of such a complex subject as creativity. And I see it as something that really requires an undoing. And out of the negative pressure of undoing what you thought you knew, a field starts to gather. It gathers momentum, it gathers material, it converts energy that propels itself. And what gets undone is what you thought you knew at the outset. And perhaps you have to rewrite the problem that you thought you were actually doing. And out of that sense of not knowing is a sense of wanting to know. And that sense of wanting to know begins this search that propels the process. And a language is formed that also starts to propel and gather. And the intention forms, the direction that the storm goes comes from that gathering. And then there's consequences. There's consequences that sometimes are small, sometimes are big, sometimes are destructive. And it's cyclical. It continues again, just as the hydrologic cycle continues. So I made this animation just by drawing on tracing paper and taking photos. And the music was done by Forrest Larson, just using a comb. I tell you also about that because I probably had undiagnosed learning disabilities when I was a little girl. It was that, I grew up at a time where not too many things were diagnosed, but my father taught me how to draw from life. And that really helped me to do many things from that perspective of the spatial cognition one forms when one draws, and the imagination and the sensibility that one develops through that process of drawing. So Anna mentioned this firm that I have with Chris Bart, 360 Architecture. I'm just trying to find my cursor to shrink all these images. But anyway, 360 Architecture here in Providence. We are an architectural firm. And it's very much the part of, includes this part of creativity, which is problem solving. And as I mentioned already, that the big part of problem solving that I think is important that I wanted to add is that you have to redefine the problem that you're given, even as an architect, even when a client comes. Because the direction, the way in which you make a problem and define a problem sets in motion the direction of its solution. And so in architecture, this is a very real and complex and quantifiable thing. There's setbacks, and there's a flood zone, and there's topography, and there's limits to the square footage you can increase. There's limits to the structure that you can build given the conditions of the site. And though all of those things starts to shape the building, as in this case. And in this case, they were so constrained that the client, who is a very important lawyer, a very powerful lawyer, kind of took the legal aspects and treated it like kind of a origami that he folded. And we worked with this way in which he reshaped the codes and the restrictions, and actually made this house that was based on this kind of folding of the conditions that we had. But it led to this split level design that allowed you on this spectacular site, which is almost a peninsula, to see out and see through and up and out and down and through and out as well. And so this was really, I think, probably a creative use of problem solving, really taking the metrics of the problem and reconfiguring it as a kind of origami. But I also want to focus on this, that beginning of undoing, that takes with it, that kind of negative pressure takes with it the redefining of the problem. And so an example of that, I don't know why I can't go ahead, is this project we did for a client in Boston, an existing space in a building in Boston that the client basically presented us the problem, and in it is a very narrow solution. The restaurant in the back, a corridor that gets you there. The entry is at the bottom of the slide, retail space in the front that is open during the day. And that's not a very good spatial solution. And so the problem had to be redefined in the classic sense of outside of the box. The box had to be reconfigured. And so what we did is we used the structure, this industrial strength structure of the building, to hang these vitrines that are made from glass to hold the retail items so that they could be clamshell during the day, allowing a passage through, but also allowing you to see what's inside those vitrines, even when the store is closed. And then we added this program of a kind of lounge DJ center. And in the back, the restaurant had these tables that were small, medium, and large, which is what the chef based his cuisine on. But now it being supported from the floor to make these different size tables. And that's an example of how the undoing of the problem allows a new problem with a more open direction to run its course. So the classic example also of creative problem solving is Archimedes and his problem of having to determine whether the crown that the king had made was actually made from pure gold. And so the story goes that Archimedes had to figure out what the volume of the crown was. And of course, that's an easy thing to do if you're working with a cube. You can find out the volume and then find out the density and see if it corresponds to gold. But because of the intricate shaping of the crown, he couldn't melt it down and cast a cube. He had to keep its shape. The story goes that he was taking a bath and that he felt the displacement of the water and realized that that was one way of finding the volume of the crown. And so the reason why I like this example is because it shows that the field here is something that he constructed in his mind from these two very different realms, one of mathematics and maybe the studio where he does solve his problems, and one of the sensual world of taking a bath. And the associative logic that he implemented to come up with a solution is so key. I mean, that's the field. It's this associative logic that one holds and one forms that's very active. That the forces of what coheres, which is what allows you to move beyond a methodology or an existing set of solutions or an existing definition of a problem. So for me, the real intentions that are creative intentions are elicited from the field. There's intentions that you start with that you might have to undo or might get undone in the redefining of the problem. But the real intentions are elicited from this field that you create. And so in this case with Archimedes, he figured out the density of the crown was actually not that of gold after he found the displacement, but he also found something that's much more important, which is the Archimedes principle that the buoyant force is equal to the weight of the displaced water. So that is something that transcends that singular problem of the crown and whether it was made from gold or not. So there's this new intention that was formed that came out of this work that he did. And so this field, how do I define this field? We use this word field. We use it to say we cross the field, we enter the field as in terms of a discipline. We talk about a force field. It's used in science and math and poetry. Field theory is used by many people. But so how do we begin to define it? You could say it's defined as a set of points or a set of conditions or content. And that, like an algorithm, you can start to define how it does get connected. Like A, none of the dots are connected. B, some of them are. C, all of them are connected. D, the ones that are not connected in C are connected in D. E, the ones that are not connected in B are connected in E. And F, they're all connected to each other. But that kind of definition of the connections of the field or the points of the field, I think falls far short of the kind of field that one makes in developing a creative work. I think it's more like poetry, as Rainer Maria Rilke in the Eighth Elegy speaks about the half assurance of the bird. As though afraid of itself, it stumbles through the air like a crack going through a cup, like the path of a bat through the porcelain of evening. So if you think about the very nuanced and particular and relational definition present in this short part of this poem, afraid of itself, this emotive quality, this erratic behavior of the bird, stumbles through the air like a crack, that slow motion of a crack moving through a cup, like the path of a bat, as we all know, that erratic behavior of a bat moving through the porcelain of evening, that glow at evening when the sun is going down, that glow in the sky relating back to the bird and also the cup. And so you're gathering a field that you've created from the world. And it depends on who's doing the gathering and for what purpose. So whether, the same elements of the field might be gathered by a farmer for one purpose or a bird for another. There's the imprinting of the function, but also of the individual who did the gathering and how different that can be from the same field. And so even when you hear a physicist, a scientist speak about their work and how that discovery was made, here Richard Feynman, when he's sitting in a cafeteria at Cornell University where he was recounting the origins of his electron spin theory, it's more of this kind of associative logic that the poet had. So he said, I had nothing to do, so I started figuring out the motion of the rotating plate, because he saw this waiter pick up a plate and it wobbled as it spun. I discovered that the angle is very slight. The medallion of the Cornell logo rotates twice as fast as the wobble rate. I went on to work out equation for wobbles. Then I thought about how the electron orbits start to move in relativity. Then there's the Dirac equation in electrodynamics, and then quantum electrodynamics. And before I knew it, the whole business that I got from the Nobel Prize came from that piddling around with the wobbling plate. And this is another example of, the workplace. Is it, how the bathtub was the workplace, the cafeteria. And here for this graduate student, Joshua Gershlak, developed a new material for developing mitochondrial regeneration tissue. That's what his work is in this laboratory here in Worcester Polytechnic. And he was eating spinach salad for lunch. He noticed the vascular system, and it reminded him of heart tissue that he uses, that's being used for transplants. And he just took it back to the lab and washed it with shower gel, and the chlorophyll washed out, and he started to pump this with blood. And that is a discovery that's now being used to develop heart tissue. And so the individual, how they see their biography, where they are, is all important, and it directs this gathering. And how one sees is so critical. For it's so individualized. There's a signature to it. It's so relevant for what I do at RISD. There's this problem that we give called blind contour, where you don't look at the page when you're drawing, and you're just trying to develop this hand-eye observation and connection. And because you're not looking at the page, you're just focusing on your observation. And there's a signature to the way each of us does that. And the glance is very particular. It's very charged, not only in terms of how it receives, but what it emits. And this is something that you can see is so important in this painting by the Russian painter Ilya Repin, The Unexpected Visitor, how the glances tells a story and how differently they receive and emit that story. And this painting was used by this scientist, Alfred Yarbus, in the Institute for Problems of Information Transmission, where he's studying the way in which people glanced at the painting. And this was a very, very early on, early 60s that he did this work that was like the first studies of these tracking the eye across the canvas. So the page on the far left is 7 different subjects with 7 different signatures of ways of looking. The middle page is one subject returning over time, maybe the next day, a week later, a month later, and how that signature of looking is still there. And then what I find most interesting is the last page on the right is that same subject, but now being asked questions like, what economic status is the visitor from? What do you think? What do you think he's coming from? What do you think these individuals, what their relationships are, and how much those questions that subject is being given changes the way that individual observes. So the power of the question is so visibly evident in this last page, as well as what I said, the individual themselves. I mean, the way the compound eye of the bee obviously shapes what the bee makes. That bee knows that this hexagonal structure is not there, and yet the shaping of its eye influences it to make it manifest in the world, which is true for us as well. How our biography plays a role in how we cohere information and what we see and what we build. One of my heroes is Katie Payne, who discovered the elephant's language, and she she felt something when she was at the zoo in Oregon. She had been studying whale songs with her husband for many years and sort of developed her own self-education about biology and animal songs. But she was at the zoo in Oregon, and before I play that, she felt something. She felt the air shudder. And when she slowed it down, I'm going to go back because I messed that up. But when she slowed it down, this is what you could hear. And those sounds are not audible to the human ear. It's only possible when you slow down because it's below the frequency of human hearing. And that's led to this Elephant Listening Project and an institute at Cornell that has for decades now been listening to what sounds like nothing, elephants in Africa, and developing an understanding of their language and rituals. But also part of her biography, and not only did she study animal voices before, the whale songs, was that she felt the air shudder when you hear a church organ at the lower registers. So, the higher sounds are like that, pitches, but then the lower pitches have that kind of shuddering. And that's what she felt when she was at the zoo in Oregon around the elephants. So this phrase from Francis Ponge, the pré is a prefix of prefix, present in present. It's also means meadow in French. It's the beginning. It's about creativity. It's one of my favorite books, and it really has influenced me tremendously. But in there, he wrote, should nature at times on our awakening propose to us the very thing to which we were disposed, which is such a wonderful thing that we all hope for, right? That moment when our biography, our CV has led us to that moment that that we enter, that needs us to be there to take the next step forward, as Katie Payne did. And it also Field is this workplace that we build that makes sense to no one, a kind of chaos that makes sense to the person who's created it and works there, like this bookbinder in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That kind of very particular chaos that is, as chaos is, the beginnings are very charged and very volatile and they can lead in many different directions. And it's a kind of chaos, I think, as a storm is, as weather is, that, and as creativity is, that I think we're at the beginning. I feel like I'm at the beginning after seeing, like, I stopped counting, but over 1,500 students work from start to finish, that you start to notice patterns. It's kind of like the beginning of meteorology, which is why I use the storm as a metaphor, that there is a kind of set of patterns. It's still unpredictable, as weather is. It's not fully predictable, but there are patterns and there are things that you can speak about. One of the greatest inventions, discoveries of all time is zero. It's one of those discoveries that's very hard to imagine away. And this is a wall on a temple in India. That little circle that you see in the center is the numeral for zero. And it, the idea, the origin of nothing was understood as shunya, but this is one of the theories of how perhaps the numeral came into being. And you can understand, if you try to imagine away the zero, which gave us the columns by which we can add and subtract and multiply and do all our mathematical functions. If we didn't have that, how complicated and difficult and slow math is. But the theory goes, if you're counting in the dirt, which was done, and you have these rocks that make impressions, and then you lift one up, that suddenly, this was a physical reminder of that concept of shunya, of nothing. So it became a thing, it became a numeral. That's one of the theories of how zero came to be. And it's an interesting one because it relates to this idea of the physical presence of what's in front of you, how it activated Feynman to develop his theories in theoretical physics, or the salad for the regenerative heart tissue. How what's in front of you, what you put in front of you, what you build in front of you, that field is so important. And so I looked up the etymology of intention, the real intention I'm talking about, the one that comes after you've eliminated what you thought you knew. And this negative pressure starts where you're trying to know something you don't know. It comes from the word tendere, which is to stretch, as inattentive. And so the real intention is something that is stretching your mind towards. So it does include the world. Just to give you, from field perspective, we're architects, we're designers, and we were working on this prefab church, Methodist church, that has this fake steeple. It's, something you can buy in a catalog, a spire. And every time we made this model of the existing church, and every time we moved it, the spire would fall off. And it, we had to build this new space, a children's chapel, as an addition to the existing church. And I was really bothered by the spire constantly falling off the model. So I looked it up. And spire comes from spirare, which is spirit, and spiral. It's something that's always expanding and contracting like breath, which was actually the directive that the congregation gave us. They wanted their church, this prefab church, to breathe. And so that led to this idea of the order of this space, which for other reasons had to be this trapezoid in plan. Its footprint had to be a trapezoid. But when you try to structure it, instead of making the sides parallel, if you make them square to each side, it never closes. It continues around like a string wrapping the space, like a spiral. And that's how the windows were placed, the structure of this building, the floorboards. The whole space became a kind of spirale, which came from that accident of the spire falling off the model. And so this stretching of the mind towards, this is me just about a month ago in our backyard. I was struck by our garden at the time I felt like the garden was dying. I mean, it's going into repose. So I haven't drawn from observation for many years, for many, many years. But I decided to do that. So I started drawing these plants that were dying, or going into repose. And it stretched my mind towards, things that were happening in the world right now with the pandemic and our democracy and social issues that are terribly disturbing in our country and abroad. And I started to, the drawing grew, 2 pages, 3 pages, 4. And what I was struck by was how much life was in this, despite the fact that the garden was going into repose. I was struck by the greenness of it. And it reminded me of this poem by Dylan Thomas, The Green Fuse. So I realized that, of course, in this segment of 2020 and of looking at the garden, that it's only one small segment, that if my perception of it changes if I extend it beyond, that it's just going into repose now. So that idea of the entering into just a simple drawing, how it then connects to something, a perspective that's much bigger than itself. And probably a better example of that is one from my father, who was an architect. He was the designer for Wallace K. Harrison, who was an architect for big chunks of New York City. And my father was an immigrant. He didn't really get credit for his work. But he designed major projects like Albany State Plaza, Lincoln Center, the Opera House in New York City. And he did drawings like this. He did this of the Albany State Plaza. And I saw those on the floor of my living room growing up. And this is Lincoln Center in New York and the Opera House straight ahead. And this story about my father, how an accident kind of brought about a very important turning point in the design of this building, but also in its chandelier. And there's a film that was made on this, about this event and about the design and the building of the Opera House by Susan Fromke, a documentary. There I am standing in the lobby with the chandelier that came about from my father's accident. And actually, this is the drawing in which the accident happened. A paint splat fell on this perspective as he was getting ready for a meeting. But I'll let this little clip from the film tell the story for me. One day, my father very characteristically is making a sketch, mixed media, grabbing anything that's in front of him, and not only of conceiving of a design, but then quickly visualizing it. So he's drawing it in order to communicate to others for a meeting. And in the process of adding some finishing touches with paint, a splat happened on his perspective, and there was no time to really start over again because it was just before a meeting.
All this paint splashed on the drawing and created some quite nice elements back in the middle of the drawing, like fireworks, Well, Harrison came and said, "What did you do now? Rockefeller is waiting, Bing is waiting, everyone is waiting. Gosh, what shall we do now?"
So he quickly added some lines so that splotch of white paint could be refracted light from the chandelier. My father was nervous about that because Rockefeller and Harrison both were thinking that they would get a traditional design for a chandelier, and this clearly was something else.
And when I brought this, Rockefeller looked, and Bing also said, "Well, it looks very nice." I said, "That's what? But it isn't this white. Don't look at this white spots and so on. Look on at the drawing behind them." And I said, no, we are talking about that. Is it possible to do something like that? And Carson looked at me and I said, yes, of course we could do something.
There's a reason why everybody went, even though they had other intentions. My father's intention was not to splash across the page. Harrison's intention was to respect Rockefeller's intention, which was to do a traditional chandelier. But they all went, there's something that is shared that's just in the air. suddenly it started to assert itself as not just an accident, but as something that could be the beginning, the birth, the genesis of the design. So that paint splat, made this. And it connected to something, I think the reason why it resonated with Rockefeller, who wanted this traditional building, and Harrison, who was trying to please Rockefeller, and why the whole project was kind of readjusted, was because at the time, electron microscope was developed that enabled scientists to see this activity, this radioactivity that was left over from the Big Bang. It was the first time there was any physical evidence of that. And at the same time, there were these competing theories about the origin of the universe. And because this electron microscope, telescope was discovered, it gave credence to the Big Bang, which hasn't really been challenged since. And because that was a very exciting moment at the time that this splat happened, that explosive geometry of the splat resonated as a new beginning, as a new cultural center for New York, and to seize that moment of this eye-opening moment about the origins of things. So another poet, a little piece of poetry. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open, there are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. Czesław Miłosz. Those invisible guests, the accidents of the paint splash, the accident of the falling spire, the invisible guest of the waiter spinning a plate. And this is me back at Cooper Union, where I learned from my mentor, John Haydock, about invisible guests. I'm holding my thesis model. And it came about probably through this project where in my second year of architecture school, we were asked to make a utilitarian object. And I decided my object would be something that defined an increment of time. And I made this very large hyperbolic funnel, which is a very complex process that you see here. But what I learned was that a work is a condensation of its making. Everything you do and you put into it stays there and speaks for you. So in the process of doing this, the humidity in the room, the temperature, the sluggishness of when I cranked this thing to remove the plaster, it's a process called drawing plaster, the shuttering of the blade, all of it got imprinted on this surface, so that when you launch this ball, it takes the same amount of time to go down each time. As it's traveling, it makes different sounds that are the imprinting of all these different stages and conditions. And those are in my knowledge of invisible guests. This is one clip of many of this machine and the sound it makes. I've also have found an interest in, and I'm not the only one, but to find ways in which you can invite invisible guests or you can celebrate them. This was a project I did now 30 years ago, but for a wood turner in Vienna. I was asked to, along with 12 other designers, to design a turn wooden bowl. And I came up with this simple relationship between a sphere on the outside and an ellipsoid on the inside. And their relationship is very volatile, which is to say, if you shift those two forms ever so slightly, this section of the bowl changes dramatically. The top edge changes dramatically. Its balance changes dramatically. And so as the wood turner would make it, he would find the bowl would be slightly different each time, or dramatically different each time. And in a way, it celebrated his craft and the nuances of his sensibility and the things that can happen along the way. So no two bowls were the same, yet their specifications are the same. The same sphere on the outside, the same ellipsoid on the inside. Of course, the slight shift between those two forms is different each time it's made. And another way in which I invite invisible guests is I've painted my dreams now for 30 years. And I've learned a lot from this. I've learned a lot about how my waking days enter my dreams, and the images are very important for me as quick references, but they also are too many times for me to not say this. They're spaces I've entered after I've dreamt them. So there's a very interesting, I want to know more about Anna's work with time travel, but there's a very interesting sort of lesson about time in through dreams and what one gathers. Now this is a rack in, I think, at the Acropolis. My students took some of my dreams because I worked in a printer in Rome when I was living there, and I was dreaming and making these postcards and printed up some of them. And my students took them around the world and put them in racks. And it was a way of distributing them because I didn't really see them as works of art, but I wanted them somehow to enter the world like seeds from a wildflower. And that's influenced me now. I make these objects of dreams because I see there's never a singular point of view. It's always a multiple point of view. So that I'm making these three-dimensional objects of dreams, but they've influenced projects. You know, there's projects where you have to make something visible that's not visible often. And this was a project we did early on for furniture for a student who built her thesis house in Bangkok, a city of different water conditions. And the furniture, wave daybed, river bench, cloud chair, underwater chair, puddle. They were all based on different states of water. And it was as if those characters were already there, but they were invisible. And that's why I'm interested in camouflage, because I think in a big way, creativity is like camouflage backwards. You're seeing something that is there, but you cannot see or you cannot pick it out, only through the process by which you get to that point where you can recognize it, which is something that Paul Klee said, art does not reproduce the visible, but makes visible. And it's interesting because he, in World War I, was a camouflage artist. He painted camouflage on planes like this. This is the pattern one of the patterns that he painted. And it clearly influenced his work. Not only his painting, but also he wrote the pedagogical sketchbook. He was a great teacher, and there's thousands and thousands of pages of his pedagogical thinking that entered his artwork, but clearly examples of camouflage that he was studying, that he's observed in nature, the relationship of the individual and the field, whether the field is divided to make the individuals multiply. What's the relationship between the individual and the field? And almost like the early exercises in Photoshop he did, how the field can have forces acting on it. And the forces that make form in the world that are invisible but become visible was something that he studied. And he studied literally cymatics, which is, get your ears ready for this, but the vibrations that can create form is something that, making visible the sound because of the vibrations of the plate starts to shape the patterns of the sand on the plate of steel, which he did. He studied that. He studied it from the particle up in scale, where form came from, how it becomes visible. And you can see that in the titles of his painting on the left, Ancient Sound and Blossoming, how something comes into being. And so the individual in the field is also, I think, really important. Where does one begin and end? And it's not, camouflage is more, but what's so amazing is that there's an awareness not only of your surroundings, but of who's doing the looking. As you can see with this octopus, it's very aware of the point of view of the observer. It's not only making itself, its texture and its coloration match its surrounding, it's making it work from the point of view of the predator. So it's aware of the other looking back at it, which was actually a subject of some work I did this summer, thinking about the camouflage that we do every day ourselves. To fit or not fit, or to shape ourselves in terms of our field, our world, our community, our society. And that kind of shaping that's social, it's visual, it's related to identity, was something that I was exploring this summer through this mask and outfit I made. And literally it acts as a camouflage, as you can see in this footage. I'm wearing that outfit here. But I think camouflage to me is very interesting because it's almost like camouflage backwards is discovery. Because the field is all there for everyone to see, but somehow our ability to perceive it, our biography that enables us to see it, to make those connections of something that now once it's seen, it's impossible to unsee, but someone had to do the seeing. And oddly enough, I grew up in a glass house that my father designed. And I was always aware of being seen from the outside. I was always aware of that possibility and would walk around the house to make myself invisible from the outside. I would walk in what's called the visual shadows. And that became an obsession of mine. I did a lot of research on how the eye is a blind spot and how that blind spot is necessary for us to see, that without it, the lens needs a blind spot to focus what's outside it, to bring that in. So actually the blind spot is the place where the world can enter, that visual shadow, which led to a study of, too long to go into here, but of visual shadows, its geometry, and how you could shape a space that's private, unlike the glass house I grew up in, that's shaped by visual shadows. But I want to just now, so that's kind of an arc of my idea of field, which was heavily influenced by this book I read early on when I was a student by Prey. I mentioned it already, by Ponge, called The Making of the Prey. And it's a manuscript that's one fraction of the manuscript that he wrote, developed, worked on in developing his poem, which he calls an essay called The Making of the Prey, on creativity, on the ground that's not solid, that's just solid enough to hold us there, but is mineral, animal, vegetal, that's generative, that's cyclical. It really influenced me. And I made my own, this is where we may have to go to YouTube, but I'm going to go to YouTube myself right now, but I made my own kind of work a year ago on trying to make my own making of the prey, but in my way, which is visual. And unfortunately, you may have to go to YouTube to see this well, because the quality, it's a stop motion animated drawing that I made, and the music must be turned on. It's by Zoe Keating, but it's my record. I never went back and edited the actual making of this. I just kept moving forward, and then you'll see what I mean. But it's 5.5 minutes, 5 minutes and 48 seconds. Please bear with me. I'm showing you this because it's my way of showing you a kind of making of the play in my way. Is my shared window working? Yes, okay, I'm gonna keep going. So this is the video that I just want you to see and hear back from you about. I have to, do we have a problem with the, are you seeing my shared window, Anna? Okay,
You need to share your desktop, maybe?
I'll do it again.
Yeah.
Sorry, good thing I saw the note.
If you're unable to see it after she tries it again, Sarah's posted the YouTube video that you could go on to and see as well.
I think I have to stop the share and start it again is what I have to do. So sorry about that. It's you know,
No problem.
it's what it is. Okay. So I'm going to get out of that. And please bear with me. It's a nice video. It has nice music. So we'll share again. Is it good, Anna?
I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, here we go.
I can't hear anything though.
It's, I think it's coming. It's
All right,
coming.
good. Perfect.
Sorry about Ivanka Trump's, oh man, you saw that from the New Yorker, right? That came up. It didn't come up on yours. Okay. That's good. My screen was obliterated for about 30 seconds.
Thank you so much, Keena. That
Sure.
was gorgeous way to also end the talk. Before we start with the questions, for those of you who came late, we're just trying to coordinate the question and answer discussion session a little bit. So I want to encourage people to ask Keena questions directly using your own audio and video features. You can do this by just raising your hand, so to speak. And I think, Sarah, can you tell them how to do this? I think you can hover over your picture and choose raise hands if you have a question. Exactly. And then we can add you to the panel, and then you can ask the questions directly. So I encourage you to do that. But of course, if you'd rather just ask questions sort of by typing it into the window, please use the Q&A function, and we will use that as well to generate discussion. So I see that Bonnie has a question. And so I have...
So shall I just ask my question now?
1 second. I will add you to the panel so that we can see you as well. Yeah, I think we can hear you, Kim, right?
Thank you. Hi, Keena. Thank you so much for such a beautiful, entertaining, and enlightening talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you,
My
Bonnie.
question for you was, did you work with Tracy Costantino at all when she was there at the Rhode Island School for Design? Because she was the, I think, associate provost or associate dean or something. And I asked that because when I was with the Torrance Center in Creativity, she was at the University of Georgia in the art department. And she and I and another woman who was in engineering worked on a project where we designed a creativity course for students in engineering and art to work together. And the emphasis on the course was on problem finding and problem solving and thinking creatively. And since you talked about that, I wondered if you had gotten to work with Tracy when she was there.
You know, I'm so terrible with names. Of course I know Tracy. I mean, she's one of the names in my head, but I haven't like actually taught with her. I'm just trying to remember what exactly she was the associate provost. Is that right?
Oh, I'm sorry. She was, I think, associate dean.
Associate
and she
dean.
has left, and now she's in California. She's an associate provost.
I see. You know, I never worked directly with her, but of course, I mean, she's one of the, you know, like the people that were, but it's very interesting that what you were doing, Bonnie, with Tracy is, you know, your problem finding is a beautiful term to describe, right, you know, the process.
And what I wanted to say to you is when the students went through this, and it was very interesting because each class was about half art students and half engineering students, and each group had their own biases against the other, you know, and their own language, et cetera. It was very interesting to finally get them to work together on problem solving. And at the end, the students were to present their project to the engineering faculty. And one student got up and he said, well, we had to find our problems. And I know that when I go out as an engineer, I won't have to do that because my clients will give me the problem. And I loved it because one senior engineering faculty member stood up and he said, no, your clients will give you a problem, but it may not be the problem. It may not be the best problem for you to solve. So if you have learned to find the problem, that's important. And so I thought that went along so much with what you have said. And
totally. I mean, I tell my students that as well, that this is what you need to do when you're in, you know, the real world with projects. Right. And, you know, I gave that example of the scientist who was following the way people see and how much the question influenced their way of seeing and what, you know, in the end, what they saw. There's a great example of this where a person, you may have seen this test where a group of students are passing a basketball and then one walks into
Right.
the room
Yes.
wearing a
Yes. And
so
they don't see the ape.
because they're asked a
Right.
question that has nothing to do with
Right.
seeing that. So it's so important, right, that you keep that problem at bay and you move through it to find the real problem. That's a great way of putting it.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. It's great.
Okay, I'll ask a question now while we wait for the others. Please, everyone, just do not feel shy. Just ask away and we will get to all of you. Keen, I have so many questions, but I think I'm going to start with what you said about painting in Rome, was it? You're painting your dreams. Mm-hmm. And I was struck by the different level. I mean, you seem to me a very, very open person and someone who lives your process, but you see, what are your constraints? Right? Like, I think perhaps in Rome, you were perhaps more open to all aspects of what you're experiencing. Was it something about are you aware of what particular other environmental settings off the field that are more inviting to you to make you more open, make you more in tune with your process? Are there aspects of, you know, is it the political environment? Is it the cultural environment you're in? Do you have any sense of what works for you and how that's changed with time, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think architecture is close to engineering in terms of how many constraints there are. There's a lot of metrics in our field, and you know, what I do with my students is more open, but I really do bring that into the way we practice architecture. In terms of the dream drawing, the constraint is always memory. You know, you know, trying to draw out the memory, and that's a process that I think is a practice that can be improved. But I would say the real answer to your question has to do with this work that I did this summer, and it had a lot to do with my trying to educate myself about Black Lives Matter, about a lot of the horrible things that were happening in our country, and finding my place in that. And I think it's still an ongoing process, but I think that what you saw, that suit that I was wearing, and a number of videos that I made as my way of processing what was happening in the world, which I really haven't shared with too many people. The thing that I came to with that, which I'm still wrestling with, is I am such a believer in creativity and the process, believing in it, directing, you know, where to go and the intentions. With that work, I felt unsure, and I felt that you know, like a storm, consequences are sometimes destructive. You know, the consequence of a storm, it generates. We need storms, right? It brings life, it brings water, it brings the most essential element to life. But it also, it propels the change and the development, but it also can be destructive. So I've been confronted by, when I've given talks, by people asking a question saying, you're assisting people with creativity, with their process, but do you ever ask yourself, are you assisting people with something that could be destructive? You know, what are there unintended consequences? Of course, everything I'm talking about is unintended consequences, the accidents that develop. But how does one navigate the territory, and how do these unintended consequences come up that maybe you know, are part of the process, that are buried in ways that we're not aware of? And that's something that I was working through in trying to, the way I think about everything. I'm not an academic in the sense of a researcher. I'm not a good reader. I don't, but I think through things by drawing, by making, and I follow that process. And with the mask and the outfit that I made, it was one way in which I tried to think through the process of, you know, constraints, and not constraints, but consequences that affect others, and how do you include that in your process, is something that I think is probably the ultimate question I have about the boundaries of my practice, you know, and that I'm questioning now. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think it's the real answer to your question. You know, it's not about a technical limits or the constraints in architecture. It's the real question of challenging what my beliefs are about creativity, allowing creativity to be this arrow. And then, but then asking myself, do you question that? How do you question that? How do you question its motor, its engine? When is it destructive? When is it destructive in ways that you can't anticipate for others?
As a teacher, I would ask you then, how do we get, I mean, we're at the College of Education, so I mean, it's kind of at the forefront of what we do. And a lot of the focus in education is not really on creativity, although it's so central to being human. And I always wonder what it is about creativity that is so difficult for us to seamlessly integrate within educational curriculums at any age. And I know that you have a wealth of experience teaching, of course, adult students and architecture students, but they come to you unripe, right? Like they come to you, but perhaps with a specific set of notions. And I'm wondering whether you have any insights about what we could do to get children to question, like to gain an understanding about how it is possible to occupy that space of ambiguity, to find that you can, you know, to understand constraints and not be afraid by them, or to see them as a playful thing to go, oh, here's the limit. What happens if I push it? So I'm just wondering what your insights are as a teacher and an instructor of what practices you do with students and how you how you get them into this zone where this possibility space where they can see more openly.
Yeah, it comes from interacting, I mean, this is where I feel like I'm at the beginning of meteorology for the equivalent in creativity, because there are patterns. One is, I think that beginnings that are original, as I agree with you, that creativity, you know, it is about originality, something that's new, that didn't exist before. And they usually are like, they're usually awkward, they're usually uncomfortable, they're usually very, very small. And I've had many sort of experiences with students where they've destroyed actually the creative beginning of their project. They've mistreated it. They've thrown it on the floor. They've thrown it out. And sometimes I look for those things, the things that are not treated so well, you know, that are, so that's an example of, you know, kind of the properties of the creative process that I'm starting to recognize, that allows me to assist my students in accepting things that also are not part of the stated intentions. That's another really important thing, is that so many times, you know, students will say, when I point out a strength of beginning in their work, they'll say, but I know actually, this is not what I was doing. And so that, you know, and I had a great teacher, historian, revisionist historian at, in architecture, who drew the drawings that the architects did of these projects to find out what the struggles were, to see, you know, the compass point that Borromini in drawing San Carlino, there's not one single compass point, but there's like 10. He didn't know where the center was. He wasn't confident about it. And so he taught this class, which was called What Architects Say and Do. In other words, it's not always the same. And so I learned that lesson from Robin Evans, is that stated intentions are suspect. And so, and I try to share that with the students, of like, that I'm a great believer in trust. I have tremendous trust in their intuitions, but sometimes our own psychology prevents us from recognizing the new beginnings that appear before us. And, you know, I say it all the time. I feel like I'm fighting for their intuition, for their creativity, sometimes more than they are. And so there's these traits that develop, like I said, the mistreated model, the psychological barrier, the same thing that happens, I think, and I would like to ask you, of not remembering our dreams, I think is very similar to this process that we go through in the creative process of fighting actually these ideas that are emerging. You know, in many, many different ways, we fight them. There's a kind of psychological battle that we have with our own creative process. And so those are things that I fight for. It's part of my practice. It's things that I start to become familiar with. And it's just what I do as a teacher.
I have a question, Kina, from Desi, and I actually had the same question, and that is, how did this concept of camouflage come to be an integral part of your work and this concept of the field?
Well, it started a while ago. It just keeps on coming up. I mean, when I was 4 years old, I was dragged around museums by my father, who had very little patience to like read every label. And we would run through the Guggenheim and stand in front of Paul Klee's painting of the red balloon because I loved it. And so Paul Klee has been a big force in my life in his teaching about teaching. And as I mentioned, camouflage was a big part of what he did. So it was always there. And without my realizing that he did do camouflage art, he was working on it. He was working on the relationship between the individual and the field. And so it's hard to pinpoint the actual, beginning of it, since I did fall in love with Paul Klee's work when I was like probably 4 years old. But it also became more conscious when thinking about where we begin and end. Are we skin encapsulated egos, or is what we are also extend beyond the body and ourselves to who we love and the work we do? And that to me is a very architectural idea. As you, the house that I showed you of Visual Shadows was always about where this line is, where the self begins and the all ends, or where the all begins and the self ends. Where is that edge? Where is that line? I mean, that's an architectural idea. It's about it. We have to make enclosures, and enclosures have windows. They have connections between here and there, inside and outside, you and me. There's doors, there's windows, there's walls that separate, but there's things that connect. So that defining the relationships between the self and the all is so fundamental to architecture. And that's what camouflage is. It's blurring that. It's blurring the boundaries of where one is and another is. And so it's all about studying the relationships and the relative relativity between things, which I think is what camouflage is. It's all about that. Different techniques of blurring the lines and changing the definition of what the parts are to the whole.
Would you say that's kind of what happens in play as well, in some sense?
What a nice idea.
Yeah.
It's a nice idea. I'm really doing the stream of consciousness thing that John Maeda, the quote, but so are you. So that's okay. Yeah, I think play, that's a beautiful idea. I have a friend who's a poet, Stuart Blazer, who always says intelligent play. Intelligent play.
Yeah.
Not work, but intelligent play.
It's a good distinction. Are there any questions that I'm not seeing somewhere? Anyone?
So we do have a question from YouTube, actually.
Yes, please.
So related to Anna's comment, in education, we often confront the view that students need to understand content in a domain before they can be creative in that domain. Of course, content is endless. So how do we respond to that view?
Yeah, and it gets, play gets heavy, right, with more content. Like how does one? I always when I taught the making of design principles, I always saw it as not providing the ground. It's not design principles, but the student makes the design principles. Because if we load all this content and principles, it's almost like this burdensome ship that you have to undo, because many of the things that the content should be questioned, right? And you may have to build your own raft after you dispose of all of this content that's served as a kind of foundational aspect of education. So it can be overturned. A single discovery or invention can overturn a lot of content, as Darwin is an example of, right? So it's a real balance in education, how one gives content, and is it something that's found, or are there principles that are found and worked on by the individual, and a language that I'm a big advocate for each student developing their own language, because language has within it this propulsion, and you developing your own architectural language, I feel much more comfortable with than giving one or imposing it on individuals. So I think today with data, the biggest, data is so tempting, right? It's quantifiable. It's so apparent, seemingly clear, and it's given as arguments. But it also, if it doesn't allow you to speculate, then I think it's a problem. It's not being used correctly, right? If data can fuel speculation, then it is serving creativity. But if it shuts it down as a kind of argument for one thing existing and not another, then it's problematic to creativity.
Thank you. Can I ask another one, just to be greedy, and since I have you here? I was wondering if you could, well, we come from in the psychology, let's say, of understanding creativity, a lot of the focus is on the product in terms of describing its attributes, how unusual it is and so on. And I would, recently I came across a view that was proposed by Elkanon Goldberg, where he talked about creative habits as being something that creativity researchers don't actually really look at much, right? So it's one thing to test somebody and say, well, how creative are you? But we don't know how they're using their abilities. And, a lot of the things about habits. And I was wondering whether it's something that we know, I think, very little about. And I was wondering, as a practitioner or someone who practices so many different forms of the creative arts, whether you identify certain habits that are, you try to promote. I don't know if there's a lot of individual variation there, but what do you think are the essential habits that are conducive to the creative eye, or the open eye,
right,
ability to live in ambiguity and so on?
Right. Well, it seems like that question is, there's a sister question which has to do with attributes as well, the habits and attributes. And so I always say that every strength is a weakness, every weakness is a strength. Like I was always, in all my report cards growing up, said she gets bored easily. And but it enables me to know what I want and know what I like. I'm very decisive about that. Whereas, I've worked with people, we've had great people work in our office who, they don't get bored easily, and they'll build every permutation of a problem, but then they sit there staring at them, not knowing which one to pursue. So to me, it's a relief to know that every strength is a weakness and every weakness is a strength. And I think the habits that go along with those types of attributes, they relate to different attributes. Some people are very talented and then it becomes a crutch, right? And some people are lazy, and some people are get bored, and there's habits that go with different strengths and weaknesses. But then there's universal habits that they're very few, but that I try to promote, like this tendency of going around and around and around. This is one example that I think everyone can benefit. But you kind of work through ideas, saying, why am I doing this? Why am I thinking of that? And then you get to the next step and the next step and the next step. And then you go back to the same, like the mistrust of whatever that idea is. And so I always tell my students to, before they go to bed or before they leave their workspace, to set up the workspace for what it is that they're going to do next. And you can be very efficient. It's my one tip for efficiency, but you can be very efficient because instead of arriving at your desk and going through the same kind of crazy process of remembering, and this is why it relates to dreams to me, of remembering what it is and why it is that you're doing what you're doing and should be doing. You know, if you have your desk laid out with the book that you need to reference and the pencil that you want to work with or the paper, whatever it is, set it up. And that enables you to sort of bypass that kind of, you probably have a good word for it, Anna, that processing of going through the loop, you know, the feedback loop again. But I do think that habits need to be tailored to different attributes that people possess.
There's a question from an attendee here that I'd like to read out. First of all, they say, thank you so much for the talk. It was great to hear about your experiments with blind contour drawing and your project around sketching your dreams. They're wanting to know what processes and practices that writers and artists who are just kind of beginning their work to use and include in their everyday life to cultivate their creativity. And then furthermore, how to go about discovering those strengths in their own creative work.
Can you read the end of the question again? What
the processes and practices, which I think you kind of just went through a little bit, but specific to writers and artists who are just starting out, what processes and practices can they use in their everyday life to cultivate their creativity? And then how to go about discovering their own strengths with regards to their creative work.
Right. Well, I think with practices, another kind of universal one is don't get stuck in thought. And that whenever, I mean, something that I believe in very strongly is to always act and think simultaneously. So like the problems that we gave for the beginning students in architecture, first day you do something. And one problem, it was to drop a piece of paper from 6 feet high, like an 8.5 by 11 normal bond paper. And it's surprising that no one knows what it does. You know, we all have a piece of paper, but we don't know what it does. And that led to a problem of making a shuttle, which is, you know, something that sort of celebrated whatever it is that it did, depending on where you hold it and release it from, to make this kind of airborne thing that enhanced that flight. And so that's one thing, is whatever it is that you do, you know, like if you're a writer, you're right, you know, don't get stuck in thought. And one way also with writing is, you know, is how do you treat language as a kind of material, you know, that it has a sound, it has a graphics, you know, how do you, you know, there's an exercise that we used to do when writing for a thesis is material as a language, is to write a haiku and then look up a word for each letter in the haiku and find all these words in the dictionary that lead to a new processing of a haiku. So this kind of working on what you're doing from different points of view than what you intended. You know, the haiku had a meaning when you started out, but then this work of developing it as a material that leads to many other words with similar letters, it opens up a whole new set of words that were not part of the intentions. And it allows you to separate yourself from that initial intention to find a new intention in the work. Another would be how to not be so critical every step of the way. So for a writer, maybe as you're writing a document, to turn the font white so that you can't even see it, so that you can act. So finding ways, you know, whether you're a writer, a musician, to act at the same time that you're thinking so that you don't get stuck in thought. Is probably the quickest way I can answer in a question like that. You know, how to make yourself present in the process so that you can be an observer of what comes up.
I think that's an excellent response, and it's one in which one of the prior Torrance lecturers really focused on talking about, you know, the act of doing, as you have I've just so well illustrated there. The actual doing is part of that process itself. And I have kind of a follow-up question, and that is maybe not follow-up, but tangential. The idea of empathy and the role that perspective taking takes in your own art and construction of your work as well.
Perspective taking, could you say some more about that?
Yeah, so one of the strategies that we use often in creativity is trying to empathize with other things not like us in order that we can garner a new perspective to then better understand whatever it is that we're studying or working on, a problem and so forth. And so I've been interested in this idea of being able to empathize with other things and how that can then inherently change our perspective. And I wondered if there was a role that you saw in your own work for the ability to empathize in that way with other things or other people and so forth.
I mean, it's so fundamental and I mean, maybe this sounds disrespectful, but there was because you said things, and I agree with you when you said things. There was a teacher I had way back in college at Cooper Union who had us talk to things, you know, publicly, like to go up to an orange and talk to it. And I mean, I think it's very architectural, like inhabiting, dwelling. Empathy is incredibly important for architecture. I think it's fundamental to teaching. You know, I think it's there. You know, I feel like there's a conversation with one's soul that you're trying to reach in order to be both a deserving witness and to have the mutual respect that's needed in teaching. I don't have any exercises that I've developed specifically for this that I can name, other than to say that I feel that it's so fundamental to the practice of both architecture, I think, I mean, I would say, and for teaching, and also even, I think as an artist, sensibility, another word for sensibility is empathy with whatever it is that you're interacting with. So it's hard for me to name a practice. I'm not a teacher of teachers. You know, I'm not in a school of education, which I think probably your school is able to speak about this much more clearly than me, because there's a more conscious education of educators, right? And for me, it's not something I've ever done. You know, I've never gone to school for being a teacher, but it's fundamental to the interaction that one must have with things and with others and with living things and with other humans to listen and to feel.
Thank you. That's great.
I'll follow on from Sarah's then, which is because you talked about sensibility, and I'm wondering about the problem with sense. I mean, we're talking about one situation where you're not we're not perspective taking well enough or not empathetic enough, but we have the other end of the spectrum as well, where people who are so unbelievably sensitive. And I mean, you spoke of Rilke, you mentioned a few lines from this poem, and I think in the art space, especially in certain types of artistic communities, the sensibility is very, very high. And I think you can get to the other side where you're overwhelmed. You get caught in that storm of feeling too much, empathizing too much. And I don't know if you care to share any of your own personal experiences there, but you must, how does someone deal with that when they're so sort of an exquisite level of sensitivity that in some ways people can't handle it? And I think this is not just true of artists, it's also true of a lot of people, you know, decide to become therapists, become overwhelmed with empathizing with other people, find it very hard to use the sense, to stay in the world of sensitivity and not become desensitized or not become overwhelmed and becoming sort of unproductive or potentially not being useful anymore in terms of, or reaching their creative ambitions in the way that they would like to. So I was wondering if you knew of good examples, or if you could tell us your insights on how to navigate that space for those who suffer from the other side of things.
I mean, I would say I suffered from it being overwhelming and debilitating when I was younger. I remember very clearly when I was in my 20s. And I think that's one thing. With time, with experience, you recognize that as part of it. And so just knowing that it is part of it helps. And that's something that I try to share with my students, although there are a few students along the way, some extraordinary students who, the semester ends and they've kind of gone into this deep wormhole, and then the whole structure of the semester vanishes. It's very unhealthy. I try to speak about how there's moments when you have to work for yourself in a dispassionate way, that you have to, it's as if you are the employer of you. And there's this kind of dispassionate work that needs to be done, that instead of deciding which way to go in the fork in the road, to go all direct, to do every option, dispassionately, or to make the decision. I mean, for me, I remember very clearly going to, actually it was the printer in Rome, to make some critical decision about another work. Go to the laundromat to make the critical decision. Go get a glass of wine. Maybe that's not a good suggestion, or go for a walk. But to take breaks, to find a way to make the dispassionate decision. Sometimes it goes beyond that. There are people who've, I just try to be there for. There's a couple of individuals that I can think of that it wasn't so specific that they could say, this is the thing that is, making, I'm at that point, which is making everything so difficult. It's not so specific, and it's more of a condition that is beyond my expertise, and they need to seek help. But I do think it's part of the process, and it's helpful for most of us to know that. I mean, Ortega y Gasset wrote about being shipwrecked, and he spoke about it as being necessary to undo this structure, to build your own little raft to survive. So it is, it is a part of it, part of the process. As far as being, it being so painful that you desensitize yourself entirely, that you, I've seen that over the years, over the decades that I've taught, that some individuals come back and they've taken on, they just found it too difficult. And I don't know what to say about that, quite honestly, Anna. I mean, it's not the nature of the people that I surround myself with, and it's not my family. It's not my father, who was my first teacher. So I don't know that you probably know a better answer to that question. I just know that knowing about the challenges of the process is helpful, just to know. And you can almost look at it with some distance that makes it easier. It means you're onto something, I think. It's just beyond that stage, usually.
You mentioned your father again. Did you know very early on that you wanted to be an architect? I mean, when did you?
No, my father told me absolutely not, and my sisters as well. Absolutely not. Do not go into architecture. So I had no plans on it, and I was studying, as our puppies, studying pre-law at SUNY Binghamton before I decided to go into architecture and apply to Cooper Union. So it just became very clear that that's where my strengths lie, and so and that's how it happened.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, are there any more questions from, I can't see anybody raising hands, but that could be just me.
I don't see any
Ebony,
raised hands.
and nothing in the Q&A video, okay. Anyone else on the panel have questions of any sort?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Based on according to your Torrance lecture abstract, you mentioned sensibility, imagination, and improvisations are agent of a field. So I thought when you talked about your father's example, the chandelier and the white painting dropping things, I think that is the perfect example of these three core capacities. And also I'm wondering, what is your strength of among the sensibility, imagination, and improvisations? Yeah, maybe, yeah, as an educator, I'm also wondering how to teach children or students how they have the balance of these core things. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't usually say this, but I think I'm good at those three things. And I think it's been driving the bureaucracy at my college crazy, even though I'm in an arts college, because improvisation doesn't work very well these days in bureaucracies, when you have to define everything a priori, especially, so I've had a wonderful experience with my drawing students this semester because of the pandemic. We've done all our classes outside and dealt with the weather. The day before class, I tell them what we're going to do. So they don't even know what's going to happen until less than 24 hours before the class, where we're going to meet and what we're going to do and what to bring. So I think those are I thank you for that observation about the story about my dad being kind of an embodiment of those three things. And I think you're right. But I think those three qualities, I think it's mentioned in my little brief, are so important, and they're under siege. Like right now, when everything is up in the air and being questioned and uncertain, and everything is uncertain, there's this kind of response. And that's why I brought up bureaucracy, to kind of nail things down and formalize them and make them into procedures. And sensibility is too unknown and uncertain, and you can't rely on. So that's got to be, kept in check as well. When I think it's exactly what we need. I think because of the question that Sarah asked, sensibility is so important. It is related to empathy to others. And, it's like, I think I mentioned about, like, it's not artists only, but the feeling of the scalpel, knowing how to cut for a surgeon, or reading a room with others in it, or the courage that imagination gives, right? That there's something else that is a counterweight to this horrible reality you might find yourself in, that you can imagine something else. Like the civil rights movement is a great example of that there is some other reality that's possible. Or improvisation, so important. We don't, with this crises that we're going through, there's no roadmap. So how do you, on the spot, make decisions? And, and arts are generally associated with arts, but they're so important for everyone in any field. And they should be, I think they really need the space for those three things need to be fought for right now, because you can't rationalize them, right? You can't use them for arguments for their existence or for choices that are being made. And so they are under siege in this time of uncertainty, and they're so important, yet at the same time, they're more important than ever. So I'm glad you brought that up. It is kind of a subtext to everything that I'm showing, that, like the field is not something that can be a priori rationalized. It is a product of those three things as well, how you interact with that field that you create.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, if we don't have any, I would like to end with one last question, Kina, if you're still up for it.
Oh, absolutely. I hope to have future questions with you now that I know something about your work.
I just don't want to turn this into this monologue. But you did touch on resonance in your talk. and that's something that fascinates me as something that's out there in the field as well. But somehow everyone, there's a common feeling to, oh, we're all viewing something that's amazing. And I find that one of the most magical things about the creative moment, in that it's not, it's this recognition sort of wordlessly of people when viewing that work of art, or that, it doesn't have to be art, of course, it can be in the sciences, it can be anything, but just that work of creation. And I was wondering if you'd care to comment a little bit on what are the factors that affect our ability to resonate with, something outside of us in the field together. Is the things that you spoke about earlier, the political, the tumultuous political sort of environment that we're in, all over the world, really, not just the US, but the pandemic and so on. I mean, does this affect our ability to reach a sort of collective resonance, do you think? Or are there times when you think that people are, does it not matter if people are in sync or not? Does it matter? Do the divisions matter, or is creativity outside of these realms and something that can be brought to bring people together, perhaps? Not to sound too corny, but something like that.
Well, you probably have to work. I mean, I think the idea that intentions stated to be somewhat suspicious of to not use the stated intentions at the outset too firmly, right? That they can't be undone. And if we're working with a group, then that's also, how does it remain an organic intention so that one that emerges is allowed space to emerge, and as you said, like if it's not new, if we go into what we see, this is where, like, if you read this Storm of Creativity, you know that I'm not a fan of the term brainstorming, because it was used in the military sense of like storming like a barrage of ideas thrown at something. And to me, that's always existing ideas, and they're, almost like weapons of one's ego with another in a group. And so, to undo is important, and because it gives space for recognizing something that comes up. And I think if you really undo what you thought you knew, I think it gives everyone space to recognize. It doesn't matter who came up with the idea, to recognize it when it appears. Rockefeller was a pretty important person to see something in that little paint splash, which is kind of sweet, to think about, that even he could do that and undo his wish to have this classical building, so, and I see that all the time in our office, and, that. And not to say that it isn't competitive. Sometimes the competitive spirit of trying to come up with ideas is getting people excited about it. It's part of the play. But I think it's important to recognize that intention, this idea that when the students say, when their work is being discussed, well, actually, that's not what it is. That ownership, there's an authority in the work itself. And that's what we're trying to have empathy with. It's not what we're trying to express some idea of our own self biography, but that there's something that we're creating in the world that gains its own authorship and authority. And it's in the world. So it's not, especially with architecture, it's someone else's home. It's someone else's church. It's theirs. We're just trying to assist it coming into being.
Right. It turns out there's one last question from YouTube that I'm going to let Ebony read out, because I don't want to not have it showcased here. So Ebony, go ahead.
So one more question, if I may. The many social crises of inequality and the climate crisis have brought us to a state of flux. I wonder what your advice would be to those who are on the front line of change.
Well, that's where this sounds, I have done some recent work with my students on the ocean and the environment with the ocean. It's there's been 4 studios that we've done, and so you know, it's been my way of directly dealing with the environmental crisis. But to speak, so I have to preface with that because it is something that I am concerned about, and I am trying to work on creatively. And there are some pretty amazing things that the students have done that could be helpful. But on a more personal level, and trying to answer that question, the drawing that I did of my dying garden is probably the greatest contemplation on that, because what I realized was that the span of time within which we are, you know, like it depending on the dragonfly is a great example. Dragonfly is, you know, much older than the human species, but it can see in 360-degree vision. It's pure sensing in the moment, and its lifespan is so short. But outside of that lifespan, it doesn't have even though it has this biologic history, its lifespan is so short, so it only sees that moment, that slice. And I think that's something that the drawing of the garden reminded me, was that, you know, it hopefully will come back in the spring. And depending on the span of time that we see and that we're in, we can have a very different picture of it. So in terms of, it was my way of dealing and being a little bit more hopeful about the condition, the social and political and environmental situation that we're in, that we're in the thick of it, but there is, if we take a bigger span of time, there's hopefully a change that will, you know, upon looking back, that we would see it as we were able to do something about it. I don't know if that makes sense. You know, in our moment, in our short little span of time, you know, it's very easy to be very pessimistic about things, but given a broader span of time, maybe things can change. But that's saying that, I still feel that of course it needs to be worked on. And I feel that is the reason why I do what I do, that I'm trying to fuel people's ability to make discoveries and inventions, to know something that we don't know. And in terms of these crises that we're talking about, we do have to know something and be able to do something that so far we haven't been unable to do. And so I'm not an environmental scientist. I am not a social scientist, but I do help people in making discoveries, and that is my way of assisting, hopefully, good change in all of these arenas.
That's great. It just reminded me of perhaps the best place to end is a saying by Rilke, who said that no feeling is final. You know, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror, just keep going. No feeling is final. So with that, I want to thank everyone who stayed with us all the way to the end, and everyone who was there from the beginning. And thank you, Kina, for this just gorgeous lecture. Thank you so much. We would be clapping so hard and loud if we could all hear if all the speakers, of all the microphones were on. You do us great honor by being the 2020 Torrance Lecturer, and so I think everyone's learned a great deal, and the lecture will be available on YouTube after this point as well for people who want to see it later. So thank you once again.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you.